Hi, I'm Kamaran Mtine, and I have the pleasure of delivering this lecture on the prospects of the Middle East for Iran academia. To talk about the prospects of the Middle East involves some sort of prediction, and in social and political world, we cannot make any precise prediction about the future of developments, because unlike natural world, we cannot incubate social world and observe regularities and patterns and draw law-like conclusions about the likely development in the future. What we do in social sciences more often is to identify the main dynamics and the most decisive trends. So we identify broad direction of major developments, which would then determine and shape more specific circumstances within smaller units of analysis. Now, in order to identify those main trends and dynamics, we first need to make a proper analysis of the current conditions. In other words, our understanding of the future depends on a proper understanding of the present. And this understanding of current conditions therefore brings us immediately to the arena of social science and social theory more specifically, because obviously the Middle East is an aspect of the world, and it's social in essence. So how do we make sense of the current circumstances in a place like a region like the Middle East? And here we, as I mentioned earlier, we rely on our sociological theories and social theory more generally. But here we encounter a major problem and also a major debate in social sciences, which is the problem of Eurocentrism. As you might know, over the last 30, 40 years, there have been a lot of explicit debates within social sciences, within different branches of social sciences, in political science, in international relations, in anthropology, development studies, and so on and so forth, about how modern social sciences are Eurocentric. So in order to, therefore, reflect on the future of the Middle East, we need to actually start from the problem of Eurocentrism in social sciences. So to deal with this question, therefore, the first question to deal with is what is Eurocentrism? Now, Eurocentrism, in my view, is a mode of analysis of modernity which begins and ends with Europe. As such, Eurocentrism has four main assumptions: a historical assumption, a normative, prognostic, and a stagist assumption. So very briefly, I reflect on each of these assumptions. The historical assumption of Eurocentrism is the idea that Eurocentric social science and Eurocentric approaches to the Middle East or any area in the world makes the assumption that modernity has emerged in Europe, and it's emerged in Europe based on its own devices and own internal dynamics. In other words, the historical assumption of Eurocentrism holds that modernity is the product of Europe alone, and it's a result of its endogenous internal dynamics. And this is related to the second assumption, the normative assumption. And that's the assumption that because Europe has produced modernity on its own, it is therefore superior to other cultures and societies. The third assumption is prognostic assumption, which is related to the first historical assumption. The prognostic assumption makes the prognosis or the prediction that the world is going to become like Europe, like modern Europe. And the manner of this becoming like Europe is derived from the historical experience of Europe in becoming modern. So the prognostic assumption, in effect, is predicting convergence of different patterns of development across the world. And finally, the stagist assumption is the idea that in the process of becoming like modern Europe, other parts of the world are going to go through the same stages of development which Europe did in its own time. You can see this stagist assumption in both liberal theories of modernity or modernization, but also in orthodox forms of Marxism. And the idea of societies moving from, for example, feudalism to capitalism, and later on the specific circumstances to socialism, is a form of stagism, that history is going through specific stages. And more importantly, these stages conceptually are constructed in reference to history of European transformation. Now, these assumptions of Eurocentrism lead to three major, what I would call spatial abstraction. The first one is that non-European societies are excluded from the theorization of modern transformation in Europe itself. In other words, the first assumption I mentioned of Eurocentrism about the historical one is kind of affirmed, because it removes the idea that the non-Western, non-European world would have any impact on the process by which modern Europe became modern. And this is an assumption or the consequence which has been systematically challenged in recent decades by various branches of scholarship, which have shown that the processes of capitalist development or enlightenment even in Europe was heavily indebted to developments in other parts of the world. The second aspect of spatial abstraction, which Eurocentrism entails, is the way in which it suppresses the violence which has involved in the interaction between modern Europe and non-European world. In other words, Eurocentrism in a way covers and remains silent on the intrinsically violent nature of colonial and imperial relations between Europe and non-European world. The third spatial abstraction involved in Eurocentrism is the fact that in Eurocentric approaches to social world, or especially non-Western social world, there is no space for non-European societies to affect in any significant way the way in which modern world dynamic might be transformed or changed. In other words, the causal agency of non-European societies are theoretically ruled out because of those four assumptions of Eurocentrism I mentioned earlier. I have elaborated on these arguments elsewhere in my writings, and I hope that you have time to read the actual text, because here inevitably I am presenting it in a very kind of truncated manner. Now, as I have mentioned earlier, Eurocentrism has been challenged in recent decades, and the challenge actually is continuing. There are various ways in which Eurocentrism has been challenged, and therefore those challenges have obviously implications for area studies in general, but also Middle East studies in particular. But I want to, for the sake of the argument, I want to focus on two main challenges to Eurocentrism. The first one is the idea of multiple modernities. multiple modernities is the idea that there is no single form of modernity. In other words, the kind of modernity which is associated with Europe and took place in Europe is only one form of modernity, and there can be other forms of modernity in the non-Western world. Now, at some level, you could say this is a step forward. However, in my view, multiple modernities actually is problematic. It's problematic because it effectively reduces the diversity in the experience of modernity to the different cultures of non-European world. In other words, it retains the centrality of Europe in kind of being the vanguard of modernity, but it says that the European modernity is going through different cultural codes and refracts through them and produces different kind of modernity. In other words, the superiority of Europe in producing modernity is not challenged. It remains in place. What is added is that this essentially European form of modernity, which has been produced in Europe first and alone and through its own devices, then spreads through cultural difference and produces different forms of modernity. So there is a kind of Weberian culturalism at the heart of the idea of multiple modernities. It also involves this notion of diffusion, that modernity is spread across the world, and this is obviously neglecting again the violence involved in colonial and imperial projects, which has marked the expansion of modern Europe. The second and arguably more influential forms of challenge to Eurocentrism has come in the form of postcolonialism. Postcolonialism has mounted a very powerful critique of Eurocentrism. It has foregrounded the significance of colonial and imperial violence and relations, which has brought the impact of modern Europe on non-European world. And these colonial and imperial relations are captured through the idea of colonial modernity, that the processes whereby non-European world have become modern have involved direct or indirect violence of the West. The critique of Eurocentrism by postcolonialism is very powerful, and it actually has also informed my own views. Nevertheless, I have argued that postcolonialism or postcolonial critique has failed to fully displace Eurocentrism or overcome it in an effective way, because postcolonialism rejects the very idea of the universal. Because part of the postcolonial critique is that the universal, which is central to Eurocentrism, always involves suppression of difference. The idea of homogeneity, which, as I mentioned at the start of this lecture, that the world is going to become like the West, and this involves eradication of difference. And postcolonial critique holds that any idea of universal, or in fact, to some extent, a general social theory involves this violent homogenization which is involved in Eurocentrism. Now, I have argued elsewhere that because of this, postcolonial critique is unable to move beyond critique and actually produce a non-Eurocentric social, non-ethnocentric social theory, because such a general non-ethnocentric social theory requires some form of the universal. And my argument has been that post-colonial critique accepts Eurocentric definition of the universal as homogenizing and homogeneous, and on that basis rejects it. Whereas one can consider a form of the universal which is not homogenizing or homogeneous. In other words, the problems of the universal we encounter in Eurocentrism is not intrinsic to the concept of the universal, but is the result of a particular construction of the idea of the universal. And I have shown in my work that how one can avoid this through an interactive construction of the universal, one which begins from diversity and difference. Therefore, universal is not about or involves eradication of difference in the way in which the Eurocentrism involves. So far, I have argued that for us to be able to speak about the future of the Middle East, we need to understand the Middle East's present situation, and that in order to understand the present situation of the Middle East, we need to deploy some form of social theory. Then I argued that when we go to the area of social theory and social sciences more generally, we encounter the problem of Eurocentrism, which has generated a lot of debates. Then I explained what Eurocentrism I think is. And I also looked at two kind of attempts to overcome Eurocentrism, and I showed why and how these two attempts have been insufficient. So then what to do about Eurocentrism? I think there is a possibility to overcome Eurocentrism, and there is an approach which can do that. In order to explain how, I return to what Eurocentrism is about, because those four assumptions, when you look at them more carefully, really boil down to the idea that Eurocentrism creates general categories of analysis on the basis of particular experiences of Europe. So, in other words, Eurocentrism looks at European history, identifies patterns of a nature of change, makes concepts which correspond to these transformations, and here is the key issue, then assumes these concepts have universal applicability and validity. And in so doing, it imposes a particular reading of European history on the rest of the world. In that sense, Eurocentrism is therefore, I have argued in my book on recasting Iranian modernity and elsewhere, that Eurocentrism is ultimately a form of internalism. You might remember from my lecture on the Kurdish question that internalism is a mode of analysis and theory formation which kind of mobilizes its material from inside a particular unit of analysis, in case of social theory, basically society or social formations. So in order to overcome Eurocentrism, really, one has to have an approach which is not internalist. And I think there is a particular approach within Marxist tradition of thought, which does precisely this, and has an interactive as opposed to internalist core to its intellectual foundation. This approach is Leon Trotsky's idea of uneven and combined development. Now, Trotsky was a Russian revolutionary, a Marxist revolutionary who was involved in Marxist and social democratic movement in early 20th century in Russia. Now, here, the theme of stagist history is very prominent in the way in which Trotsky formulated his idea of uneven and combined development, because Russian Marxists at the early 20th century knew that Russia is a society full of developmental and political and social and economic contradictions. And they kind of believe that Russia is going towards some form of radical change or revolution. But their understanding or perception of this radical change or revolution was Eurocentric, in the sense that they would locate Russia on the historical line of development which had been articulated with respect to Europe by Marx and others, and make predictions on that basis. So for most of the Russian Marxists, Russia was too underdeveloped to produce anything other than a bourgeois revolution. Bourgeois revolution is a revolution in which pre-capitalist feudal social and political relations are overturned. A bourgeoisie or capitalist class comes to power and develops forces of production, industry, economy, and this gives rise to the dominance of working class in society. And as a result, the situation is prepared for a socialist revolution in which the workers would play a leading role. So in that sense, Russian revolutionaries really didn't expect a workers' revolution in Russia. Their Eurocentric frame of analysis told them that Russia is going to become, to experience what Europe had experienced in late 18th century with French Revolution, and also, English bourgeois revolution of 17th century and so on. In fact, Engels wrote specifically that Russia was approaching its 1789, i.e. Russia was going to have some sort of bourgeois democratic revolution. Now, Trotsky was more or less alone in arguing against this position. He was very struck by the 1905 revolution in Russia, in which, even though the revolution was ultimately unsuccessful, but working classes played a key role, especially in St. Petersburg, where Trotsky was a leading figure within, the Soviets, the workers' councils which were involved in the revolution. So Trotsky began to reflect on this linear theory of history, which had led Russian Marxists to generally rule out the possibility of workers' revolution in Russia at the time.